Riley Gaines, a top-ranking American swimmer and campaigner for genuine female rights, joins Jordan Peterson on his podcast. During her athletic career, Gaines qualified for Olympic trials in 2016, has won 5 SEC championships, and is a 12-time NCAA All-American, as well as being the SEC record holder in the 200 butterfly. Gaines had every intention of finishing her collegiate career of swimming and pursuing dentistry after graduation, but has decided to speak up for the issue at stake in sports co-opted by men claiming to be women. Her powerful voice and testimony make her a credible voice for athletes and her sport. Riley decuesses her experiences as a female athlete competing against males and the injustice they face. She talks about the impact of this infringement on herself, her teammates, their performance, and their health, including mental health. Gaines has spent 18 years of her life dedicated to swimming, having started when she was 4 years old. She transitioned to swimming year-round at the age of 8, and by middle and high school, practices lasted for several hours every day, with some before school and some after. Despite the grueling schedule, Gaines loved the team, setting and achieving goals and winning. She attributes her drive and competitiveness to her upbringing and growing up with 3 siblings, all of whom were athletes. Gaines' family includes a father who played SEC football and NFL, several uncles who played NFL for over a decade and won Super Bowls, and a mother who played Division I softball. The guest, Riley Gaines, does not see ambition as something selfish, but rather acknowledges that it is important to set high goals and work towards achieving them. However, they also agree that there is value in experiencing failure and learning from it, as it can build resilience and character. Peterson points out that learning to take defeat in stride and move forward despite it is crucially important, and competition can provide the context to do so. Gaines states that the benefits of competition go beyond just athletic achievement, including the development of lifelong skills in determination, grit, resiliency, leadership, accountability, and responsibility. These skills can translate to success in other areas of life beyond sports. Riley says that she would not have had the confidence and leadership qualities to take such a position if it were not for her experience as an athlete. According to an Ernst & Young study, 94% of C-level executives who are females were once female athletes. Gaines explains that being an athlete teaches one various skills that translate beyond the sport. These skills include developing confidence in oneself and the ability to tolerate stress, which are important in taking a public stance. Gaines was also a team captain in college, where she had to develop skills to reconcile the demands of being the best athlete on the team with the necessity of being a team leader. As a captain, Gaines wanted to be someone who could unite everyone in the team, even though they had different personalities, communication styles, and ways of handling pressure. She aimed to be someone that everyone could talk to and constantly reminded the team of the goals they set. By doing so, she produced an organization predicated on the intrinsic alignment of interests, where each person pursued a personal goal that served a superordinate goal that moved the entire team ahead. Jordan Peterson adds that the alignment of interests is one of the most effective leadership strategies that help each athlete become the best they can be on the personal level, which benefits the team as well. He notes that great managers have a light touch and are good at aligning people's interests so that everybody is moving in the same desirable direction, which is useful in executive management. She believes that as a woman leading, it's difficult to hold each other accountable because women tend not to like to be assertive in that way, and they take it personally. But Riley feels she did a pretty good job of holding people accountable in a way that made them want to do better. However, she believes that she could have improved on being a little more understanding. According to her, it is hard for her to put herself in someone else's shoes sometimes. So she would tend to be quick to get snippy at someone without considering other factors that could contribute to poor performance, such as sleep, She believes that leading a group of women is different from leading a group of men. Men tend to concentrate on the goal at hand and ignore other concerns. There is less tendency for overt conflict among women, but more tendency for covert conflict. Riley feels that women tend to be more moody and do not take constructive criticism well, whether from the coach or other teammates. They tend to have catfights even over personal issues, whereas men will say personal things to each other, but it doesn't necessarily apply to their sport, and they are able to move on. Riley Gaines comments on how women tend to experience negative emotions more frequently than men due to their proclivity towards neuroticism, which makes it more difficult for women to cooperate in a team setting than men. Jordan Peterson then discusses the topic of sex differentiation in sports, specifically whether or not all sporting events should be co-ed for the sake of radical equality. Gaines argues against this idea, stating that men have intrinsic physical advantages over women that would make it unfair for female athletes. Peterson then attempts to push the argument to its extreme by suggesting that women's sports should be scrapped altogether in the pursuit of fostering the highest level of performance. Gaines counters this proposal by asserting that women have their own physical ceilings and deserve to be celebrated for their uniqueness in the sporting world. Peterson then argues that high-level competition is important not just for setting absolute records, but for modeling the ability to push the envelope and transform oneself in a competitive realm. In this portion of the podcast, Jordan Peterson and Riley Gaines discuss the concept of sex-segregated spaces in society. They agree that it's not optimal to have spaces isolated to a specific sex, and therefore most enterprises should be open to both sexes. However, they also acknowledge that there may be certain domains which should be sex-segregated for the purpose of facilitating development. One category that Riley Gaines believes should be protected is athletic competition. Peterson brings up the thorny question of whether certain spaces should be male-only, such as frontline combat. Gaines agrees that where either sex is vulnerable, those spaces should be sex-protected. For example, prisons, shelters, bathrooms, and locker rooms should be sex-segregated for the protection of women, as they are vulnerable in these places. They agree that there are certain areas where biological differences between men and women become paramount. For example, it would be inappropriate for a male to be in a women's locker room for the protection of the women. They also consider how sex differences might matter in areas like the workforce, intelligence, and military rescue. They agree that sex segregation becomes necessary where sex is relevant. The fundamental markers of potential merit, such as intelligence, would require no sex segregation. However, where physical strength becomes paramount in a field, sex-based discrimination may become appropriate. Riley Gaines discussed the level of discipline required to become a high-level swimmer. Peterson asks about the social and relationship sacrifices that had to be made in junior high when Gaines was spending 4 hours daily practicing swimming. Gaines explains that such dedication involves giving up a normal childhood, missing out on proms, vacations, and sleepovers with friends. In college, there were bigger sacrifices, such as missing weeks of school at a time, which affected her education. She also had to miss the funerals of loved ones because she couldn't leave college to go home. The world of extreme sports revolves around the sport, and everything else falls in line behind it. Gaines shares how the COVID-19 pandemic made things even harder, as she and her team had to be away from the pool for months, which took a toll on them mentally. It was a challenging time, especially when they had trained for the fastest meet in the world, the national championship. She had to swim aimlessly up and down the lake because the pools and gyms were closed. Peterson notes the high level of dedication involved in achieving one's goals, which meant there could be no days off, taking it as an important lesson for anyone who wants to be successful, irrespective of the profession. Peterson and Gaines go on to discuss that when a biological male undergoes a certain amount of physiological or psychological transformation, they can now be deemed a woman, which creates a problem when they compete in sports against biological females. Gaines shares that although she and her female teammates had not faced this issue in competition until NCAA championships in March 2022, they had practiced with men who could easily outperform them. However, it was not demoralizing for them since they understood that they were competing against people who had the same limitations as them. Gaines goes on to explain that it was in the March 2022 championships that she and her teammates faced Leah Thomas, a transgender swimmer who was previously a male swimmer. Gaines had never swum against her before, but acknowledged that other schools had dealt with this issue throughout the season. Gaines describes how they found out about the situation and how they responded. She explains that they did not have any psychological reaction when practicing with men who could easily outperform them, and it was more of a driving factor to compete against them and set new barriers for themselves. In November-December 2021, Riley Gaines was aiming to become a national champion in her senior year of university swimming. At the time, she was ranked third in the country, behind one athlete she knew personally and another, Leah Thomas, who she had never heard of before. Gaines found several red flags with Thomas, the first being that she was swimming for the University of Pennsylvania, which Gaines had never known to produce fast swimmers. The second was that Thomas was a senior, which was unusual as swimmers typically peak when they are younger. The third was that Thomas was ranked at the top in all freestyle events, from sprint to long distance, which is uncommon in a sport where small differences in specialization are significant at a high level. Gaines was unaware that Thomas was male until an article stated that Leah Thomas is formerly Will Thomas and had swum on the men's team for 3 years before transferring to the women's team. Gaines was shocked but relieved when she discovered this information because it made more sense why Thomas was dominating everyone in the sport. Rediscovering footage of Will Thomas allowed Gaines to see how his superiority was unpresented, and so it made sense that he was still dominating the women after switching teams. Riley reveals that Will was ranked 462nd nationally among men in the previous year, and his decision to compete with women was not a lateral move. However, the NCAA governing body allowed him to compete with women and saw nothing wrong with it. Jordan questions the motivations for choosing to be spectacularly successful on the female front, which he believes is not part of fair competition. He then asks Riley to speculate on the mental gymnastics required to think of yourself as a winner after choosing an opponent you can easily defeat, such as competing in a contest for girls in the 10-year-old division. And what kind of mental state do you have to be in to do that? Riley suggests that it boils down to selfishness and entitlement, where those in the trans movement feel owed something, disregarding everyone else's happiness, feeling safety, privacy, and dignity. Jordan expresses his disgust at the situation, highlighting the 18 years of preparation that Will went through to be subjected to a crooked championship with an unrepentant narcissist. He acknowledges that while swimming is a physical sport, there are several psychological shockwaves that come with facing a man who has decided to compete as a woman. Gaines explains how the media attention and awkward whispering on the pool deck made her feel like she was living in a twilight zone. According to Gaines 2 years ago, if a man entered a woman's locker room, he would immediately be arrested or charged with indecent exposure or sexual harassment. But now the situation has changed, and Gaines claims that it was being celebrated and encouraged, which made her feel uncomfortable. She also talks about the traumatic stress disorders caused by situations where somebody cannot believe what is happening. For 18 years, she had played a straight game, and it was difficult for her to compete against another competitor, Will Thomas, who now identifies as Leah. Leah competed in the 500 freestyle event, which Gaines did not compete in. She recalls watching the event, during which Leah dominated and beat everyone in the water by multiple seconds. She also mentions that in swimming competitions, one swims in preliminaries in the morning, and if they qualify for the top 16, they move on to the finals in the evening. During preliminaries, Gaines met another swimmer, Reka, who was standing next to her, out of breath and with a high heart rate, waiting to see if she made it to the finals. Reka realized that Leah's heat was the last one, and that she was going to be on the cusp of making it back. Gaines explains how watching Leah dominate the event made her uncomfortable. Riley Gaines, a former American swimmer who competed in the NCAA, recalled an incident during a competition when her teammate, Reka Georgi, was overlooked for a national title. Despite being one of the most talented female swimmers of all time, Georgi only placed 17th due to a technical issue, which left her heartbroken. Another swimmer, Leah Thomas, won the national title by beating everyone by seconds, including Gaines and Georgi. The next day, Gaines and Thomas both competed in the 200 freestyle and tied at the exact same time, down to the 100th of a second. However, When the NCAA official looked at both of them, he gave the trophy to Thomas, leaving Gaines empty-handed. When questioned about the decision, the official cited chronological order and the need for trophy photographs as the rationale. Jordan Peterson questioned Thomas's behavior in accepting the trophy despite the lack of evidence that he deserved it, and called it extraordinarily narcissistic and entitled behavior. Gaines explains how it felt like she had been reduced down to a photo op and how everything she had worked for her entire life was being reduced to a photo opportunity to validate the feelings of a male at the expense of her own. She talks about the implications of Title IX and how they were being thrown out of the window by allowing women to lose out on opportunities and spots on the podium to a male athlete. Peterson agrees, stating that it is the opposite of progress. He questions why female athletes agree to compete against trans athletes in the first place, and suggests that the majority of female athletes likely believe it is a travesty. Gaines suggests that people are silenced on this issue and that her teammates were forced to attend mandatory LGBTQ education meetings to learn about how they were oppressing Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer who beat them unfairly. In this portion of the transcript, Jordan Peterson and guest Riley Gaines discuss the experiences of female athletes who have been emotionally blackmailed and gaslit by their school administrators for expressing discomfort with sharing locker rooms with transgender athletes who identify as women. Gaines mentions that these girls were told that they were not allowed to take a stance because their school had already taken a stance for them. Moreover, they were also threatened with losing their jobs, scholarships, and playing time if they spoke out against this issue. The girls were made to feel wrong for wanting fair competition, which was traumatizing for them. One of Gaines's teammates, who had been sexually assaulted in the past, expressed her discomfort with sharing the locker room with a transgender athlete. She was told by her coach to be inclusive, which was unfair to her. Peterson calls the administrator's behavior evil and criminal. She felt betrayed by the school administrators who did not warn them beforehand and did not seek their consent. She talks about how the guidelines for the locker room were made unisex so that any man could have walked into it, and it felt like a betrayal and belittlement because no one mentioned it to them. Jordan Peterson emphasizes that it was not just a betrayal, but also a conniving, cowardly, and sneaky move to come up with something like this. And it was absolutely unforgivable. He also talks about how it was a bad experience because of the 6'4" narcissistic wannabe who was parading around. In the next part of the transcript, Riley Gaines talks about her experience of being invited as a guest by the Leadership Institute, which upholds the freedom of speech and tries to advance the conservative movement on college campuses. When she arrived, she was supposed to meet with the campus police department, but they never showed up. She thought she knew what she was getting into, but realized later that it was a naive thought. Jordan Peterson asks her if she considered herself a political creature and if she had a political home or affiliation. Riley Gaines responds that she has always been politically knowledgeable, and her views align conservatively, but she did not have any political background or ulterior motive to be in her current position. Gaines recounts an event that occurred at Simon Fraser University in which she was invited to give a speech. Gaines arrived and noticed a crowd of protesters who, in her opinion, had the right to organize as long as it was peaceful. After giving her speech and participating in a Q&A session, everyone began to leave when suddenly a mob of trans rights activists entered the room and turned off the lights. The group rushed to the podium where Gaines was speaking and physically assaulted her. Gaines notes that the police were not present during the event and were unprepared to handle any aggression. When the lights went off, Gaines says that she felt completely disoriented and confused as to what was happening. Furthermore, members of the mob were dressed as males and females, making it difficult for her to identify the trans rights activists who were attacking her. She and her team were violently attacked and had to be rushed out of a room by an officer who she believed was with the police. She was barricaded in another room along the hallway and was trapped there with an array of violent words hurled at her. For hours on end, she feared for her life as protesters yelled vengeful and hateful things. The protesters yelled out, "We fight back," which ironically was verbatim the same verbiage used by the press secretary during a conference about the trans community. Furthermore, the protesters hurled words like, "You shouldn't have come here. You knew we would riot. Let us handle her ourselves," referring to Gaines. The officers present outside the barricaded room were also insulted with racist comments like, "You're only protecting her because she's white." When asked what would have happened if the protesters had gained access to her, Gaines expressed that the protesters explicitly said they wanted to hurt her, and she didn't know to what extent that would look like. She noted that the protesters were unhinged and relentless, suggesting there was a genuine fear for her safety. Gaines was the only person barricaded in the room, with a few officers filtering in and out. The campus officers reportedly stood outside the door to prevent the protesters from tearing it down, but they were scared and seemed to be only concerned about being seen as allies to the community. Gaines mentioned that the officers were terrified and pitiful, and one officer even had to push back an African-American protester but was immediately accused of racial profiling. Gaines notes the vice president of student affairs sent an email to the entire student body applauding the students who had barricaded Gaines and were engaged in peaceful protests against her. Peterson sarcastically comments on how Gaines must be quite a monster that she was able to manage to get herself barricaded in a room. They also reflect on the corrupt institutions and how these institutions are ready to throw their own students to the wolves. Gaines's experience and the corruptness of institutions have already been through fire and the hammer, giving the listeners an existential shock. Riley Gaines shares how it initially made her feel like she was doing something wrong. However, she later realized that the mob only reacted that way because they had nothing else to dissuade her argument other than their emotions. She sees this as a sign that she is getting closer to the truth, and she has increased her security as a result. The situation has also backfired on the left because it has opened the eyes of even those who typically lean left to what the left is capable of doing when they do not agree with someone. Gaines hopes to enact change through testifying at state and federal levels and upholding Title IX. She's doing everything in her power to combat the movement and fight for all girls and women, regardless of sport, level, age, or confidence, so that no one ever has to go through what she went through. She is pushing for a sense of accountability among universities, administrations, and the government to understand how male trans inclusion in women's spaces is harmful and to acknowledge it. Jordan Peterson commends Gaines for her effectiveness and the way she has held her head up during the surreal situation at San Francisco State, where the administration sided with the mob. He sees the universities as having many sins on their conscience, and this charade is emblematic of what is going on in higher education. Despite the challenges, Gaines has not backed down or apologized for her stance. They go on to discuss the issue of transgender athletes participating in sports events meant for biological women. Peterson expresses his interest in speaking with Leah Thomas's teammates and the university administrators regarding the mandatory ethical retraining programs they undergo. He finds it inexcusable and maliciously stupid to ask athletes to undergo such programs as a solution to their complaints. Instead, he acknowledges that the real problem is the participation of transgender athletes in biological women's sports. He sarcastically adds that if biological women complain, they are told they are mentally ill and are asked to be adequately compassionate. Peterson and Gaines then discuss how this issue has turned into a cultural war. Peterson urges viewers to support those who oppose transgender athletes competing against biological women in sports. The conversation provides insight into the problems that biological women face in sports and highlights the need for a better solution rather than mandatory ethical retraining programs.